Hello, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on Palestine and Israel. My name is Hannah Cherno, and I am the coordinator of the Human Rights team at UNHS Scotland. Thank you so much to everyone for attending. It is incredibly important, especially given what's happening in the world today, that we talk about humanitarian principles and human rights in the same conversation together. Our first roundtable discussed the efficacy of having such an approach in a rights-based framework, especially in providing a guiding force for the incorporation and implementation of human rights into Scottish law. We hope to take this sort of thinking forward into different environments and contexts. The thinking around humanitarian principles started with the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which heavily looks at the consequences of using nuclear weapons on the health and welfare of those affected by such weapons, and argues that such weapons should therefore be banned. We felt that this new discourse could be the basis of human rights as collective rights. With this in mind, our roundtable today will be looking at how exactly society in Palestine and Israel can benefit from a humanitarian approach to human rights law, exploring the different rights and violations of rights and the impact on human beings as a collective as opposed to individuals. Following on from this roundtable, the Human Rights team at UNHS Scotland will be writing up a follow-up report, which we will share with all of you. Today, we'll be hearing from a variety of speakers from different backgrounds and perspectives on the current situation in Palestine and Israel. Dr. Sania Veselovska from the University of Strathclyde, Shireen Jurdi from the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, Dr. Eirik Skandrit from Queen Margaret University, Sir Vincent Fien from the Balfour Project, followed by a response from Dr. Jasmine Ghani from the University of St. Andrews. I would like to thank all of our guest speakers for being here with us today to share their invaluable experiences and expertise. This will then be followed by a Q&A and discussion session, where everyone here will all have an opportunity to raise questions to our speakers or prompt points of discussion. You may write your questions or comments in the chat box at any time during the event, and we will collate these for the Q&A. We will then finally close the session with Claudia Beamish, former MSP and co-convener of the Scottish Parliament Cross-Party Group for Palestine, who will provide closing remarks. So before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to remind everyone of a few housekeeping points. If you could please make sure you're muted if you're not speaking, and if you would like to come in at any point during the Q&A discussion session, please use the raise hand function. Alternatively, you may pose your questions in the chat. And finally, this event is being recorded. However, certain parts of this event will not be recorded in order to ensure the comfort and safety of all participants. If you do not wish to be recorded at any point during the event, we recommend turning your camera off for the duration of the roundtable, and we will also let you know when we stop and start recording. Thank you everyone for your patience and understanding. If we could kindly stop the recording here so that we may begin, we will announce when we will start the recording again.
Great, so I am now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Shireen Jurdi. Shireen has almost 20 years of experience working in the field of peace building and conflict prevention. As per her work at the Permanent Peace Movement and as the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict MENA Regional Liaison Officer, she has spearheaded the establishment of the MENA Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, and has also established the Working Group of Women and Conventional Weapons in MENA. Currently, she builds community work through establishing an early warning, early response system in the MENA region. Welcome, Shireen. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I want to thank the previous speaker and to build on the previous session. Maybe it's important for us, yes, when we talk about Palestine and Israel, it's important to talk about the peace processes and about the issue of transformation and conflict resolution and things that has been discussed not only at the peace table but at the grassroots level. Here I want to link it back to the humanitarian approach and how the TPNW was able to access this treaty through a humanitarian approach. Once we talk about this prolonged conflict and this prolonged process of occupation in Palestine, we see like what kind of transformation is needed in case we are talking about peace. there is no peace without justice, and definitely there is no justice without equal human rights approach and without a humanitarian approach. One of the things that I want to tackle is the gender aspect of the Palestinian women's movement and the Palestinian implication of colonial and occupation. In May 2022, we've witnessed the assassination of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Shireen Abu Akleh, though for many she can be a journalist, but for Palestinian and even for the Arab world, she was a women human rights defender in the sense that they were trying to document the processes of the issues of crimes or the issue of bombardments and how civilians are impacted in this prolonged occupation. We've seen 2 days ago that the court assumed and had one of the parts that admits killing Shireen Abu Akleh, but still saying that the soldier will not be charged. This is one of the issues that is public, and this is one of the issues that you deal with at this public space. This gives me back also within a historical narrative. In 1948, upon the creation of the State of Israel, women who were fleeing the process of 1948, there was a story of a woman who had to flee carrying a pillow instead of a child, and she was only able to realize that it was a pillow and not the child until she received the destination. Another issue, the IDF was able to have certain measures of using these policies of gender norms that the Palestinian society has in terms of honor that is related to women issues in the processes of the expulsion of refugees. So this is just like a historical background of the issue of the whole thing in Palestine and Israel, to look at what is to be done. So within this process, we see there are double structures of a way that women in Palestine are resisting. So they are resisting the patriarchal structures within the Palestinian Authority structures, and at the same time, they are resisting the occupation. We have seen, as one of our partners were putting it, that women human rights defenders have issues of different perspectives, lack of resources to water, since most of peasantry, Palestinian community, it's a peasant community. So you have who owns the national resources and who has access to natural resources and who controls the natural resources. And here where we see women human rights defenders trying to put forward the issue of agriculture, the issue of water, the issue of olive grains. And this is something that is also correlated with the issues of structures of the occupation and how occupation also hinders the supply of water and other things that promote agriculture. We have seen as well that as our partner Iman would say, our partner, which is the MENA Nonviolence Democracy in Palestine, which is based in Jerusalem, had a documentation about the issue of mobility. There was this small video, and I didn't know like what was the purpose of that video until I watched it at the end. It was a birthday party where a woman had a party with different plates waiting to receive her guests and her friends. And all of a sudden we could see that every second she receives a phone call and she removes one plate from the table until she celebrates her birthday alone. Why? Because of the checkpoints. So like you're receiving your family members, or you're having any kind of a meeting, or you're planning any kind of event, and then all of a sudden there is these checkpoints. So we have the issue of who controls the resources, the issue of mobility and checkpoints that are done at frequent times. There is the issue of education, and even education, how it is set. The issue of mobility is also correlated to education and how students are able to go. And this is all definitely how women human rights defenders are impacted, not only as women human rights defenders, but also as women at home. This is in terms of the private and the public spaces. We had also issues in terms of the humanitarian approach. If we want to talk about the humanitarian approach of human rights, the night attacks that houses receive, and women or children are being kept in custody, where even mothers had to leave their jobs to stay at home when their children are being set at home after being in prison because they are resisting the occupation. There are lots of things that has to do with the relationship between women under occupation and the issue of resistance that women are undergoing in different spaces. And in this space, you can see the kind of vulnerability that women faces in these spectrums. We have seen lately that women human rights defenders and the women's movement in Palestine has been very active in different spaces. Now, in light of the preparation of the 16 days of the November 16 of days, it seems like now even there's this kind of work that the women in the feminist peace movement in Palestine are divided among themselves, in the sense that, is it that we're only working towards the nationalistic approach in terms of occupation, or is it that we also want to work towards the feminist movement or the feminist demands that women have in terms of equality, not only regarding the occupation, but also equality in terms of the Palestinian personal status law, the issue of child marriage, the components of CEDAW, and other factors as well. So the women's movement is at the heart of this struggle in terms of the occupation, but at the same time, they're trying hard to move the society within equality approach. We have seen lately how there's a huge backlash against the feminist movement when we look at what happened to the demands regarding CEDAW, and women were called that they were trying to westernize the different agendas. So women were trying to push forward to say, no, when we were talking about the personal status law, about the equality, about the child marriage, it's not about westernizing the agendas. Also, as part of issues of occupation and cultural heritage, we have seen lately how the women movement was trying to also to win over the issue of embroidery. And there was a huge campaign where Palestinian women were trying to push forward the embroidery and calling it a Palestinian embroidery and not an Israeli one in one of these Miss Beauty legend. Unfortunately, the shrinking spaces in Palestinian civil society is increasing. I don't know if you were following the news, but you could see that in August, there were several human rights defenders organizations that were shut down by Israeli forces, calling them illegal and unacceptable. And these organizations are actually raising the flag and raising the voices and documenting what is happening at the Palestinian level. To bring all of this into fact, just try to imagine that you're living in a house that you're not aware whether tomorrow you will be still in that house, because there could be any decision at the demolition of that house, or at the raiding at night of that house, or of getting your son or your daughter out of this house and putting in prison. The implications of putting especially women human rights defenders in jail, which is different from maid, is the issue of honor. And this puts women at a stigma which they cannot follow. So just they are trying to work towards human rights, but they themselves are stigmatized in their own communities. These shrinking spaces, unfortunately, are increasing in Palestinian community, and women are at the heart of these shrinking spaces. The issue of impunity, the issue of double standards in the international community. We have seen lately how the war on Ukraine increased the public awareness of the issue of occupation, and how feminist movement were paying solidarity, and like it was a huge solidarity campaign with Ukrainian women. And this is a right. This is a right what they're doing. But just look at the difference. I mean, like the other day I was listening to self-defense and the need to have weapons to self-defense, whereas we never heard Palestinian women calling for weapons for self-defense. We heard Palestinian women calling for to stop war. And that was the thing that Palestinian women were calling for. They were calling for international solidarity. Mona Kurd and her brother in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, were calling for international solidarity to stop the acquisition of their houses and for them to stay at home. So these are all different debates that we need to look into. We have seen how the ICC is trying to document the crimes against humanity. Maybe it's also important for us to come up with recommendations how to make a gender-sensitive approach to these crimes, and what are the implications of these on women and families at large. I think these are some of the points that needs to be tackled. Once you are a woman and you're talking about equality, you're talking about a human rights approach at different spaces, but still in the structure itself, you are a weak state that doesn't have even a say within your own structures. So the challenges and the difficulties for Palestinian women is humongous, but still what they do is something that we need to not only to appreciate, but to help in alleviating and amplifying what they do, how we can amplify their work, how we can also make this solidarity worldwide among feminist organizations, among peace organizations, among conflict resolution organizations, peace building organizations, and how even at the political level, how we can put pressure to abide and comply with UN Security Council resolutions that were never implemented or applied by Israel. So definitely we are against militarization. So we want definitely this area to live in peace. Palestine is a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty. We hope that states also do comply with that in terms of sending armaments and putting the different measures of violence or killing of whether children or youth or women at large and family members along different lines. Maybe we can have lots of time now for discussion. Just I wanted to raise issues that are at the heart of every person in the Arab world, not only in Palestine. And I'm a Lebanese, so this is also a perspective that I'm giving, even like I'm not a Palestinian, but still you can see the sufferings. And we see also the suffering of refugees. And we see even like how the UN agency has a special UN agency, the UNRWA, for the refugees in Palestine. Just see like the complications of the whole system and how this impunity and the lack of accountability is leading to further escalation of violence, not only in Palestine, but also at the region at large. Thank you, back to you, and I hope we will have time for discussions.
Thank you, Shireen, for your insightful comments on gender and human rights. It is my great pleasure to now introduce Dr. Eirik Skandret. Dr. Skandret is a senior lecturer in public sociology at Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh. He worked as an environmental scientist before moving into community education and was head of community action at Friends of the Earth Scotland. He was part of Friends of the Earth International's observer mission to Palestine, and in collaboration with Palestinian activists, has published on the environmental impact of the settler colonization of Palestine. He is a trade union activist, secretary of Scottish universities supporting Palestinian students, and chair of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome, Dr. Skandret, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alina, and thank you, Shireen, the previous speaker, and previous speakers. I'm going to be talking about environmental violations of the occupation, and this is, of course, a gendered issue, and many of the defenders of the natural resources of Palestine are women. In my connections with Palestine through Friends of the Earth and other environmental organizations, I've witnessed a wide range of environmental injustices associated with the Israeli occupation, all associated with human rights breaches with humanitarian consequences. When we did our Friends of the Earth International Observer Mission, we called our report in 2012 the environmental Nakba. The Nakba being the catastrophe of ethnic cleansing that was perpetrated by the Zionist militia in 1948 in order to carve the state of Israel out of Palestine. What we witnessed, and what I've witnessed elsewhere in Palestine, is a continuation of ethnic cleansing through environmental means. I'll give a few examples. Wadi Fuqim is a village in Bethlehem district. An illegal settlement has been built on the hill directly overlooking the village. The sewage outlet for the settlement has been positioned directly over the agricultural land of Wadi Fuqim, very visibly and blatantly discharging untreated sewage onto the land, poisoning it and making it unusable, and therefore susceptible to being seized by the Israeli state or settlers. Wadi Fuqim is a very visible example of what is occurring across the West Bank. Discharges from the settlement of Ariel, enormous settlement, have polluted the rivers and wadis for miles. In Jayus in northern West Bank, it is solid waste, a mountain of Israeli waste due to unregulated dumping for years. Amongst the residents of Jayus, there are clusters of cancers similar to toxic waste dumps elsewhere in the world. In Edna, Israel has another approach to waste disposal called recycling. Having lost some 80% of its agricultural land to Israeli confiscation, Edna's unemployed have sought work in an informal recycling industry in which Israeli waste is dumped in the village and broken up, incinerated, blow-torched, etc., with no environmental regulation or worker safety protections, in order to extract the materials that can be sold back into Israel as, in inverted commas, recycled. Beside the West Bank city of Tulkarem lies Nitzanai Shalom Industrial Estate. It is located in the seam zone between the separation wall and the green line which marks the ceasefire with Jordan in 1948 and the de facto border of the State of Israel. In other words, the industrial estate is within the occupied Palestinian territory, but behind the Israeli wall, and access is controlled by the Israeli occupying military force. The industrial estate was established when the Israeli company Gashuri was relocated from Israel because of pollution infringements. There are no controls in the seam zone, either Israeli or Palestinian. No means of regulating or monitoring environmental violations, health and safety of workers, human rights violations, all of which have been reported. Workers who have raised concerns have had their permits rescinded by the Israeli military, thereby losing their livelihoods. Bravely, workers organized through the Free Trade Union from the Yamit factory went on strike in January 2021. And with sufficient solidarity support from trade unions across the world, the repression was muted and a negotiated outcome achieved. Water apartheid is probably the best known environmental injustice of the occupation. As a result of the Oslo Peace Process Accords, the Palestinian Water Authority actually has no authority to approve water infrastructure in the West Bank without approval of the Israeli occupiers. Meanwhile, water infrastructure for the illegal settlements is provided by the occupiers. As a result, on average, Israelis have access to 600 liters of water per person per day, and those in the illegal settlements, much more. Whereas West Bank Palestinians have less than the minimum World Health Organization requirement of 100 liters. In Gaza, water access is even more dangerous. The aquifer that serves the Gaza Strip is over-extracted, and the river that would replenish it dammed by Israel, so that seawater seeps into the aquifer. Moreover, the materials required for desalination on any scale and for sewage treatment are prevented from crossing the Israeli military blockade. Within Gaza and also the state of Israel, toxic herbicides have been used to destroy Palestinian agricultural land. The weapon of agri-chemicals has been used to evict Bedouin in the Naqab or Negev, who still attempt to control their resources as they have more or less sustainably for centuries. And they have become a front line in the battle between colonizers and Palestinians over resources. These represent environmental injustices as a means of ethnic cleansing, the environment as a tool of settler colonialization. Environmental violation as ethnic cleansing has been a modus operandi for Zionist colonizers since well before the establishment of the State of Israel. Central to this process is the Jewish National Fund, which Ilan Pappé describes as, and I quote, the principal Zionist tool for the colonization of Palestine, end quote, but which describes itself as Israel's largest green organization. The Jewish National Fund was established by the World Zionist Congress in 1901 with the objective of acquiring Palestinian land for Jewish colonization. In 1948, when the Zionist militia expelled Palestinians from their homes, they handed large areas of Palestinian land to the Jewish National Fund. In order to prevent Palestinians from returning, the JNF planted trees over their villages and agricultural land, which also had the purpose of Judaizing the environment, as it was called, transforming the landscape from looking Arabic to looking Northern European, which is where most of the early Zionist pioneers came from. The JNF continues to deploy ethnic cleansing for settler colonization under the cover of environmentalism and operates as an environmental charity in many countries, including Scotland and the UK. Settler colonization is a distinct form of colonization with environmental implications. While classical colonization exploits the natural resources, labor, and markets of colonized territories for the benefit of a colonizing state, settler colonialism has no colonizing state, and the settlers only exploit the natural resources of the colonized. Settlers have no long-term need for indigenous labor or indigenous markets, and so expel or annihilate the indigenous population, including through environmental destruction. Settler colonial states include today's USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, which have in common the dispossession of natural resources and ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population. Settler colonization is incompatible with a humanitarian approach to human rights. No other settler colonial state has yet resolved satisfactorily its relationship with its indigenous populations or its natural resources, although there may be some lessons from older settler colonial contexts for the situation in Israel-Palestine. Canada's peace and friendship treaties with First Nations have been used as leverage by alliances of indigenous and settler activists to oppose fracking in Macmaki in eastern Canada. Although the disaster that is the tar sands exploitation in Atlanta demonstrate that those treaties do not result in indigenous control of resources. South Africa is perhaps a closer source of learning. Formal apartheid was ended through a combination of popular struggle consisting of non-cooperation, non-violent confrontation, and pockets of violence, combined with international solidarity actions of boycott and divestment, which made apartheid South Africa politically ungovernable and economically unworkable, to the extent that the government had nowhere to go except to negotiate with Nelson Mandela. South Africa has ended formal apartheid, but can hardly be said to have indigenous control of resources. We do know that environmental sustainability is best protected when indigenous populations have control of them. This may well be in collaboration with others, including settlers, but indigenous control is central, and that means decolonizing the relationship between indigenous and settler populations, including in Palestine. So what does that mean in practice? In the West Bank, that means dismantling the infrastructure of the Oslo Accords, which was designed to deny indigenous Palestinian control of resources. In Gaza, also, it means an end to the blockade. Essentially, it means an end to the occupation of 1967, which was consolidated in the so-called peace process, and to hand control to the Palestinians in these territories. The move towards indigenous control of resources within the State of Israel must start with honoring the right of return for refugees. These are the indigenous people who need to control the resources. That is, Security Council Resolution 194 needs to be implemented so that Palestinians can drive the management of resources. Collaboration with Jewish settler population then needs to be in a decolonized relationship. At a minimum, this means dismantling the various laws within Israel, nationality laws, nation state law, other apartheid laws. These are all human rights and humanitarian demands. The mechanisms to start tackling environmental injustices are those that decolonize the settler colonial nature of Israel-Palestine, ending the occupation of the lands colonized in '67 and the discriminatory laws within the lands colonized in 1948, whilst honoring the rights of the refugees to return. These are also the demands of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign from Palestinian civil society, based squarely on human rights. As Palestinians resist the colonization of their resources through disruptive confrontation and non-cooperation, what the international community can do is support boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, a human rights-based demands through non-violent means. Thank you.
Thank you, Eirik, for your very interesting talk on the environmental impacts of the occupation. I'm now honoured to introduce our next speaker, Sir Vincent Feehan. He's a member of the British Diplomatic Service from 1975 to 2014. His last post was as Consul General Jerusalem, 2010 to 2014. Before Jerusalem, he was Ambassador to Libya and previously High Commissioner to Malta. Vincent advocates equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians and British government recognition of the State of Palestine alongside Israel on pre-June 1967 lines. He's the Vice Chair of Trustees on the Balfour Project. Welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Himani. Thank you. And thank you to previous speakers. It's very good to follow Eirik and colleagues. It's right that we should be talking in a UN forum because the United Kingdom handed this problem to the United Nations in 1948 because it couldn't handle it alone. My theme today is equal rights in Palestine and Israel. I speak in my own right, although as Himani said, I am Vice Chair of the Balfour Project, a Scottish registered charity seeking to shed light on a period in British history when we, the British, played a decisive role in the affairs of two peoples, who are now the Israelis and the Palestinians. The charity advocates equal rights for both peoples. Neither Israel nor the Palestinians can be wished away. Neither is going away. And the charity sees a need to focus on ourselves and what we can do as UK civil society, parliaments, I say that in the plural, Scottish and Westminster parliaments, and the British government, to advance equal rights, to respect international law without fear or favour. Looking at the scene that's been described very eloquently by previous speakers, it's self-evident that Israelis, particularly Jewish Israelis, have rights and exercise them. Palestinians, particularly those in the occupied Palestinian territories, have few to no rights, are under military occupation in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, and are prevented from particularly exercising the right to self-determination. So we try to focus on what the UK can do and has a historic responsibility to do. That entails upholding the law without fear or favour. And I regret to say that our government has been selective in its upholding of the law. To advance equal rights to the ultimate benefit of both peoples, and I would contend that justice and equality for the Palestinians is in the long-term interests of Israelis and of the State of Israel. One of the human rights team's questions, good questions, is about responsibilities of foreign powers. The United Kingdom has that responsibility in spades. Another question is what is being done now to improve the situation on the ground? The answer is virtually nothing. There are some efforts by the Biden administration to, as they describe it, shrink the conflict, which means do as little as you can, but try to avoid violence. There is great danger in doing virtually nothing. There is a vacuum, and on the Palestinian side, an absence of hope. And with that, every risk that futile violence could fill that vacuum. What are the challenges on the ground? Eirik has summarized them very well. So did Shireen. Settlements in East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank are designed to prevent the emergence of a sovereign Palestinian state, which is British government policy to see two sovereign states living in peace side by side. The systematic, forceful military control of Palestinians by the Israeli army in the occupied Palestinian territories, where they operate with impunity. There is a lack of trust between the two peoples. How can there not be? The ultimately futile violence is the recourse of people in despair. Currently, there is unwillingness, lack of readiness on the part of the Israeli political leadership to negotiate on what Eirik summarized, the final status issues. That unwillingness was clearly stated by Prime Ministers Netanyahu and Bennett, and now Israel is heading for yet another general election, the outcome of which we cannot forecast, except to say that the center-right, the right, is very strong. In Palestine itself, there is political paralysis and division between Fatah and Hamas, and little coming out of Ramallah to engage the international community. It's quite important not to equate the two things I have just said. The military control and implementation of the occupation is one thing. Palestinian political division is another. They are not equal. This is not a struggle between equals. You have to look at where the power lies. And there is an asymmetry of power, which is almost overwhelmingly in the hands of the State of Israel. Shireen mentioned the shrinking space for Palestinian peaceful activism by women, by the young. It's true. That's what makes this issue urgent and why this discussion matters. Should the international community incorporate humanitarian principles in addressing this? Yes, this is a collective issue. It is not selective. It is not just about individual rights. 2 million Gazans are not locked in selectively. It is collective punishment. The question I pose is, what is enforceable? The UN Declaration on Human Rights is highly relevant. So are the UN Security Council resolutions. Most of them, well, anyone that's passed, adopted by the United Kingdom, including Resolution 2334, the last UN Security Council resolution in the twilight time of Obama in 2016. But what is enforceable? Does introducing humanitarian principles lead to a better chance of enforcement? It's a question. Enforceability requires political will, which is lacking in the West. Despite that moral responsibility, primarily on the United Kingdom, to advance equal rights. One of the earlier speakers mentioned mediation. Mediation on the basic issues ceased in 2014 with the end of the Kerry initiative and has not resumed. These are the reasons why the Balfour Project has come into being and now exists, to try to explain to our young people what was done in our name through the Balfour Declaration and the conduct of the British Mandate, what is being done or not done in our name now, and to seek change by democratic means of education, persuasion, advocacy. I fear that the Westminster government currently is going the wrong way on this issue, with selective respect for international law, with talk of moving the British Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a la Trump. I commend particularly to you our website, www.balfourproject.org, not because it's ours, but because it is a source of factual information about the declaration, about the conduct of the mandate, about our retreat in 1948. And some questions are posed there about what we should be doing now. At this point, I'd like to quote from a set of remarks by a colleague, Roger Spooner, a co-founder of the Balfour Project with his wife, Monica. He says, since the beginning of the Balfour Project, I've learned a lot about Britain's actions working towards a Jewish state in Palestine from as far back as the 19th century through the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the Palestine Mandate ending in 48. But it is only very recently that I've begun to understand what Britain did at the end of the mandate. We negotiated with our client state, Jordan, for Jordan to take over the parts of Palestine not going into the Jewish state and to prevent the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state. Anyone interested in getting a glimpse into British treachery or realpolitik, call it what you will, should read Raja Shehadi's new book, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, which Raja launched at the Edinburgh Book Festival last month. It's a great book. It tells the story. At the Lausanne Peace Conciliation Conference in 1949, just after the end of the mandate, Shehadi's father tried to negotiate with Israel, which refused on the grounds that the Palestinians did not have a state. This has continued to today. British recognition of a Palestinian state, in our view, would be a step forward for Palestinian rights and in no way detrimental to Israeli rights. It would be a step towards equality. What role for Scotland? Well, here I defer to Claudia Beamish, who will sum up our discussion. But back in 2019, following a Balfour Project conference in Edinburgh in March of that year, Claudia and colleagues initiated a debate in the Scottish Parliament, including a call for recognition, a ban on settlement, trade, and so on. The Scottish government advocates recognition of Palestine on pre-June 67 lines, although recognition is a decision for the Westminster government. That's not the only action needed to advance equality between Israel and Palestinians, but it's an important one. It's a step towards that enforceability of human rights, which is lacking today. And on recognition, where the UK leads, I believe others would follow. It's not about one state or two states or the status quo. Certainly the status quo needs to change because it's a status quo of domination by one people over another. My humble advice to our audience is to listen, learn, visit if you can. I was impressed by Eirik's experiences on the ground. You could sign up to the next Balfour Project webinar, which is on the 15th of September, 3 p.m, when we're talking about two states or equal rights pending a solution. You could write to your MSP and your MP, make a noise, keep Palestine on the agenda where it needs to be. Silence means you agree with or accept the status quo. And I believe you do not regard the status quo as acceptable, nor is it. We may not have all the answers, but we are trying to ask the right questions, as is the human rights team at UN House Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Vincent, for your insightful comments and questions on humanitarian principles and enforcement of rights and resolutions. I am now delighted to introduce our final speaker for today, Dr. Jasmine Ghani. Dr. Jasmine K. Ghani is a senior lecturer in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews and co-director of the Center for Syrian Studies. She writes and teaches on colonialism, knowledge production, US-Syrian relations, ideologies, social movements, and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Ghani. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Adama. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to all of the previous speakers. I've been asked to respond, and there's so much richness in all of the presentations. What I will do is actually pick out some key themes and propose an argument to position, which I think the majority of our speakers actually were moving towards this consensus, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. And that is actually to reflect on the entire framing of this event. We've talked about a humanitarian approach, and what I would suggest is actually this is a part of the problem. And that actually what we're needing to do, and what a lot of our speakers have actually been advocating, is a shift away from a humanitarian approach to a political approach. And now this is actually grounded in some respected academic work. The example I want to pick out is the work of Susan Akram. And she's done a historical analysis of the United Nations bodies that were set up shortly after 1948 in order to deal with the Palestinian issue. And there were several bodies, and a number of them actually had political agency. And in the 1950s, those bodies actually stripped of their political capacities. So some of those capacities were to hold parties accountable, and also with the capacity to bring parties to the negotiation table. They were stripped of those capacities, and they were rendered almost entirely humanitarian bodies. And Susan Akram describes this as a key problem in the entire history of what has been dubbed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I'll come to that label in a moment. And she talks about this as a protection gap, right? The humanitarian approach has typically meant that bodies that were actually set up to deal with this issue have been rendered politically toothless. This is a key problem because a lot of the issues have been discussed by our speakers. There are ideological reasons, there are military reasons, there are political reasons why we're seeing the current status quo, the unacceptable status quo. So the solution is a political solution. So humanitarian approach, for all of its laudable qualities, suggests that we're talking about a natural disaster, an environmental tragedy, but actually it's about political decisions. And I believe one of our speakers referred to this, or rather political dereliction of responsibility. To talk about humanitarianism also does feed into a type of both-sidism, right? As if we're talking about a nationalist conflict where there's parity between the two sides. Our speakers have eloquently spoken about absolute disparity between the two sides. Here we have to question the use of terminology. So our speakers have been using different terms. I think we need to move away from this label of the Arab-Israeli conflict. First of all, the Arab-Israeli conflict, it is ideological. The term Arab in that phrase quite consciously erases the Palestinian identity. Palestinians self-identify as Palestinian, whereas Israelis, particularly those who are not in support of Palestinian rights, tend to refer to them as Arabs. So this is the first thing that we have to rectify, is calling the Palestinians by what they want to be called and not erasing them. A part of that is also recognizing the need for Palestinian voices, even in spaces like this. The second thing is also the term conflict. And many of us been guilty of using this as a shorthand to refer to this issue, to the dispute. What does a conflict represent? It seems to symbolize that we're talking about a dispute between two states, two equal parties, those who have equal responsibility in this. How can you mediate, right, between two parties where one does not even have a state? It did not have political representation in the United Nations until prior to the Oslo peace process, right? So this is also something that we need to start disbanding, right? recognizing that actually we're talking about a military occupation, and that the other side here is an occupied people. So we're needing to move away from references to conflict, nationalist disputes, to using the term settler colonialism. And again, a couple of our speakers did explicitly use this terminology. And this is in fact backed by international law, right? So this is not something that is disproportionately politicizing the issue or favoring one side. This is something that actually has been designated in the United Nations. It has stipulated, especially with the UN Security Council Resolution 242, that what we are seeing is an occupation of territory, an illegal occupation of territory, and a demand for Israeli withdrawal from that territory, Palestinian territory. The United Nations has also recognized that there is a violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So again, this is rooted in international law that actually was devised after the Second World War, prohibiting forcible transfer or deportations of people, in this case, the Palestinian people, which has been occurring since 1948 and even prior to that date. And it also prohibits an occupier from settling its own civilians on annexed territory, which is happening continuously, especially in the West Bank, but also other cities within the Israeli states that are Palestinian-dominated cities. This has been supported by numerous United Nations Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions. If we look this up, there's over 150 resolutions that are reaffirming these laws, right? So the actual wording of UN Security Council Resolution 242 stipulates the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, which is precisely what happened in 1948 and again in 1967, and demands a withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied. Now, this resolution has been backed up by other international bodies, such as the International Court of Justice, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and until 2019, with the arrival of the Trump administration, every single government in the world, including the United States, and only with the exception of Israel, believed that Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territories was illegal. So what we are talking about here, even if legal practitioners, academics, NGOs, human rights activists can all recognize that international law is often used as an instrument for the powerful, actually we have a multitude of laws that actually is designed to deal with this very issue. And yet Israeli settlement construction has continued for decades, and the Oslo peace process has come up a number of times amongst the previous presentations. And actually it was during the peace process in the 1990s that settlement construction actually increased the most, right? In 2020, an EU report on settlement construction identified the fact that the number of Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem alone, which is actually Palestinian territory, has risen to 220,000. That's settlements, not people, compared to a Palestinian population of 340,000. That's going to continue to increase with the evictions and demolitions of Palestinian homes, by the way, a practice that began under the British when it held the mandate over Palestinian territory. So that East Jerusalem, to give one example, is now encircled by settlements and it becomes uninhabitable for Palestinians. So what we're talking about is the existence of international law to deal with these strategies of colonization. The question is therefore political will. And again, this has been identified by a number of our speakers. It's not that the mechanisms are not there. And if we're going to talk about political will or a dereliction of responsibility, we must turn to the United States, which has effectively underwritten Israeli military occupation through its aid budget. The United States provides $3.8 billion a year in military aid to Israel, with an additional $8 billion of loan guarantees. So anything that the United States, regardless of who's at the helm of its administration, that it says about Palestinian rights and its right to sovereignty and self-determination is rendered completely ineffective and not worth the paper it's written on when we compare it with this continued aid, especially directed towards the military occupation, which the United States itself has recognized is in fact illegal according to international law. So if we now bring it back to some of the changes in recent years, I think this shift from a humanitarian approach to recognizing this political approach has already been occurring, especially with NGO organizations, some of the most respected internationally, like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and even the United Nations issued a declaration earlier this year where they have decided, after much deliberation and years of research, to call the situation in the occupied territories, but also within Israel itself. So we're not just talking about an end to the occupation of the West Bank, an end to the blockade of Gaza, but also the situation within Israel. They have used the term apartheid for the first time. And this represents a really significant shift. And so therefore I go back to this question of, if we're using the language of mediation, we're using the language of conflict resolution, resolution of what? Mediation of what? We are seeing forces here. There are ideological forces that have grown exponentially, especially since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So we're talking over 20 years now of a right-wing expansionist movement that doesn't recognize the Palestinians' right to exist, let alone live on that territory. And there's numerous statements openly have been made by current politicians in the Israeli Knesset today that have made these statements. So mediation on what grounds? One side is having to contemplate mediating or negotiating its dignity and their right to exist as a people. This is unacceptable. So I want to end by saying, and I think I would draw this from a number of the presentations, we need to see a shift in the parameters of the discourse. That's a starting point, obviously with a view to seeing some material effects politically, and naming the situation for what it is, which is settler colonialism. If you look at a lot of the historical discourse of some of the early pioneers of the Israeli state, they very happily drew upon the settler colonial language and strategies and examples from Europe, because it was acceptable for a long period of time in the early 20th century to use that kind of language. So it's not actually controversial to recognize it as that. That would also mean that we shift what we're comparing this situation with. We move away from peace and conflict approach to then comparing it and moving it away from a humanitarian approach to comparing it with, as fellow speakers have actually been doing, with other examples of settler colonialism, other examples of apartheid, and to start thinking about the solutions as being reparations and decolonization. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jasmine, for your insightful response to what has been said and for bringing in your own expertise into the discussion.
We encourage everyone to do the same by either responding to something that has been said or by posing a question of your own. This time we have now is for everyone to reflect. Please feel free to write any questions in the chat box. We use the raise hand function to ask questions. Yeah, Hermione.
I would like to thank all the speakers for a very interesting talk, and I've gained some new perspective on the subject matter. I would especially like to thank Dr. Jasmine Ghani for summarizing much better than what I could have said about the humanitarian approach to the problem. I think my question, I suppose, would be: could we also delve into sort of the colonial aspect of the problem, not just in terms of the settler colonialism that Israel is practicing in Palestinian territory, but also in terms of colonization, the way that Western powers think of colonialism and the way that they've imposed that colonialism in handing out Palestinian land, especially in the British context, the way that Palestinian land was handed over to sort of correct a wrong, as people like to say, when it wasn't really theirs to hand over. I'm particularly posing this question because of the situations that I've come across in my time at university here, where there are sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit instructions to not talk about the Palestinian problem, where universities explicitly state that Palestinian student organizations are not allowed to form on campus and they are not given formal recognition. And in fact, quite strict actions are taken against Palestinian student organizations. Meanwhile, Israeli propaganda and far-right Zionist organizations like Stand With Us are openly permitted to distribute pamphlets on university campuses. So if Dr. Jasmine Ghani could address some of that.
Thank you, Humani. The issue of what people are allowed to say and what they're allowed to identify as being the issue has become increasingly contentious. What I would want to really stipulate is what I'm seeing is a shift, especially amongst student populations, in first of all their awareness of this issue, but also the constituents, right, amongst the student population who are calling for Palestinian rights. So whereas 10 years ago, it might typically have been something that those who identify with the left or those who actually come from the region might have been calling for Palestinian rights, I'm really seeing students who themselves, for example, identify as Jewish, those who come from the United States, those who might not have been the obvious constituents of calling for Palestinian rights, really advocating for the need to recognize the injustices in this context. So that's the first thing. I think from that, quite important solidarities can be built. The importance of evidence, right? Historical evidence, contemporary evidence is, I think, paramount, right? So when these conversations are had, sometimes there are risks and there are dangers that they can become sort of shift beyond what is an acceptable balance. And sometimes there are dangers in reference to, for example, anti-Semitic rhetoric. So in those contexts, always recognizing that we have numerous reports, we have a lot of evidence-based discourse that allows us to speak about this issue in, I would say, a relatively objective way, without it becoming something that is targeting a particular community and retaining the political aspect of the discussion. So those are the two things I would say. Identify solidarities on campus because they are there, and recognize a multiplicity of voices that don't just come from one particular political viewpoint. And secondly, have an evidence-based approach. The final thing I would say is if we look at some of the colonial underpinnings of who's allowed to speak or what we're allowed to say, yeah, this has gone back decades. And I mentioned in my presentation that up until actually relatively recently, the Palestinians didn't even have their own delegation at the United Nations. They were represented by the Jordanians, right? And that tells you everything, right? Their entire issue, refugee crisis, the loss of territory, the demolition of their homes, they couldn't discuss it themselves. So I think that's something that we need to recognize in any space where we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is to engage in our own reparations, right, intellectually and politically, in ensuring that those Palestinian voices aren't erased and that those voices are represented in these spaces.
Thank you so much for that response. We have a question which is kind of a general question to all speakers, so whoever would like to answer, you're more than welcome to kind of just, in essence, shout out. It is, there has been a discussion on political will and the need to turn it to a more political approach. What actions can the everyday person take to turn the tide, convince their governments and prevent some of the human rights violations? For example, are there any strikes, protests or petitions which could be signed?
Do you mind if I chip in first? There'll be quite a few people to comment, I'm sure. The Balfour Project believes in advocacy as well as education, and in the last 2 months, we've tried to stimulate letters to our members of Parliament, the Westminster group, Westminster parliamentarians, about 3 things. One is the potential development of a settlement at E1, which would close off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, finally. It's already almost closed off. The other 2, one was about Masafa Yatta in the South Hebron Hills and the potential demolition of homes and eviction of up to 2,000 people, regarded by the Israeli Supreme Court as legitimate to enable a firing range to be used without any human beings on the range, and that's wrong. The third one was the attack a couple of weeks ago now on 6 or 7 Palestinian civil society NGOs in Ramallah, when they were shuttered and their staff threatened with arrest if they went into the offices. What's the impact of those events? It's partly to keep the issue on the agenda. The issue has slipped down the agenda because of other challenges in the world, Ukraine, etc. Because, sadly, there is fatigue. There's fatigue among aid donors. There's fatigue among political activists. There's fatigue. And the move to actually resolve the issue, I won't call it a conflict. Jasmine is right. I won't call it a conflict. It's disproportionate. It's asymmetrical. It's not a conflict. The fatigue of looking at it for 40, 50, 60 years is wearing on people. But we try, and keeping the issue on the agenda, keeping it alive, keeping the issue going is important. Last remark, I fully support what Jasmine said about Palestinian voices. She's right, until 2012, Palestine was not regarded as a state by the UN. Palestine is still not regarded as a state by the UK. I want that to change. The webinar that I mentioned on the 15th of September has a guy called Sam Bahour speaking. He's a Palestinian American living in Ramallah, talking about recognition or equal rights or both. We try on our platforms to give peace-loving, non-violent Palestinians a voice.
Could I come in here as well to answer really both of the questions that have been posed, because I mentioned the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, BDS, which I think is a very well-structured and well-organized call by Palestinian civil society for international solidarity and based on human rights, but a politicized understanding of human rights. And bdsmovement.org is a way of finding out more information about that. And Vincent mentioned the South Hebron Hills, which I think is another very live issue where the populations are being evicted, and the Palestinian organization Stop the Wall has a campaign running at the moment, the Masafa Yatta, which is the Arabic for the area of South Hebron Hills. So if you look on the Stop the Wall website, that's a campaign that can be joined. And in my introduction, it was said I'm chair of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. There are a number of Palestine solidarity organizations in Scotland. Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign is hosting a meeting that's directly relevant to the question that Hamani raised on the 27th of September in Edinburgh, where Professor David Miller will be speaking, who has been sacked by Bristol University following a sustained campaign by Zionists on campus. And he's speaking about free speech on Palestine and solidarity with academics under attack. So hopefully, if you're in the vicinity of Edinburgh, you might be able to come to that meeting.
Thank you, Arik. Shireen, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting to, because, when I first started, I didn't know exactly how the discussion would go. And it has been a long time since I've heard the sessions with solidarity to Palestinians. So I want to thank you first. And I recall now with all the examples that we had in terms of the political humanitarian approach and what is to be done. So now, after long years of the lack of the political will, okay, I see Jasmine's point, like it's not a humanitarian approach, but what kind of approach can we have or do we need to do to have a visible approach of what is happening in Palestine? Because we have now an example of what is being done at different spaces. I recall in one of my master's courses, we had Palestine 1948, and I had the paper of how and why did the Palestinians leave in 1948. As part of the research, it was with evidence-based, that it was based mainly on four periods and 4 plans. There was a plan A, plan B, plan C, until there was a plan Dalit, which was in 1948, where the British authorities gave the positions to Zionists and to the Israeli groups at the expense of the Palestinian. So all of this goes back to saying, like, also what we had in here. It was a 1.3 refugee in Palestine that left in 1948, where it was called a land without a people to a people without a land. So this whole thing gives you back the narrative at that time. It was more like the Arabs and Palestinians in particular did not have much literature on the fact, or it was more of an apologetic literature that this is how it was depicted. It was until Benny Morris came, and then Ilan Pape and Kais Ferro, with all these the studies that they had, we tended to see exactly what was being done in 1948. But one point I want also to say to Jasmine, you're right about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but what is meant in terms, it's not the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of putting Palestinian as Arabs, but because also the conflict is not only in Palestine. For example, it's also with Lebanon and with Syria, like you have parts of Syria and Lebanon that are being occupied. And this is like why it's called Arab-Israeli conflict, but definitely the conflict of occupation and the issues that we're talking about today, for example, it's the Palestinian-Israeli occupation. The changes in the narratives, and definitely what we want to give it the name, give it the names. Yeah, you're right. Definitely, you're right. And I think this is also has been raised lately after the Sheikh Jarrah with Muna al-Kurd, with Muhammad al-Kurd, the issue like how they were able to access the media, the hashtag that went viral. And I think with these narratives, there was a turning point in the history of using the exact terminologies in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and in terms of the settler colonial power and other factors. So it's really like now how really we want to move forward, and the issue of political will. Is it easy like for us to talk about the political will while we see all these violations of human rights? And we see it now because of social media. We see it on our different platforms, but it's numbers, and this is the problem. They don't have names, and we need to raise the issue. They have names and they exist, and they are not numbers. And it hurts when we talk about numbers of people being killed. It's done on a daily basis. People are being kept in small areas. The issue of the right to live in a decent, the right to live in with your honor, with your decency. With, I mean, these are lots of issues. But also maybe at the AU level, there is the Article 2, which says like also European states will tend to have this human rights like parameters of how to deal with states, but maybe this is also that where we can work on and try to put certain restrictions and to highlight what is being done. Definitely the student movement now is a very strong movement because the young have access to social media, and they see even like famous maybe football players and how they are talking about certain campaigns, or like TV stars, or they also play a role in how they alleviate and put the narratives in perspective. These are some of things, but definitely I'm very much today inspired, and I feel that it is on the table because of what we were discussing today. And I want really to thank you all for this webinar and for this session.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you to the speakers for their responses. I apologize that we are going slightly over time, but before we close, I'm now delighted to introduce Claudia Beamish. Claudia Beamish has had a long-term commitment to Palestinian rights and to a two-state solution. She was an MSP for a decade and was co-convener of the Scottish Parliament Cross-Party Group for Palestine. She visited Gaza in 2011 with the European Council for Palestinian Relations. The floor is now yours, Claudia.
Right, thank you very much. Lara, I feel quite overwhelmed by the magnificence of the discussion and the information that we have all been given this evening. And I don't intend to reiterate things. People have things to go to, whether it's childcare or maybe people are speaking or listening from home or whatever. But I found it very moving and inspiring to listen to so much information that has sort of pushed me into recalibrating some of my thoughts. And I hope that that has been the case for other people this evening. The human rights team at UN House is very special. And I want to thank Hannah for all her coordination. And it's no secret, I think, that you have big challenges ahead academically and that you are stepping down at some point in the not too distant future. So I think that's important for all the work she's done. And I also want to thank UN House itself for not just this event, but for their, if I may say so, wise and quite visionary way of supporting the interns today and on other days, and for other events and for other things, because you who are helping today through co-chairing, through organizing, through contacting speakers, through rapporteuring, if that's the right word, are the future of a way forward which is just and fair. And the degrees you're doing give you the impact, I mean, the knowledge to make the impact that you, we hope, will be able to make in the future. I was, last week or the week before, I became 70, and I'm quite shocked by that. I don't really feel 70. Sometimes I feel much older at the end of the day, but I often feel younger, but that's sort of irrelevant. What's so wonderful is to see a new generation listening, exploring, and being adventurous. And I think the speakers today, I want to give a hearty thank you to as well, because I know I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure everybody else who's been part of this roundtable has learned a lot as well. And I'm not going to shy away from the human rights name and title for your team, the interns who are here, because I know that is very central to the future of our global situation. And the word humanitarian as well, having been to Gaza, as was mentioned by Lara, you know, it was just so terrifying to see that people didn't have fresh water and had to queue for food at the UNRWA place that we visited, and well, in the military occupation, you know. I'm not going to shy away from those words, but I've sort of scrapped part of what I wrote because I thought, yes, I'm using the word conflict, although I believe in what has been come out of today, particularly, I think, in terms of how it is such an asymmetrical situation. Now, we all know that, but therefore, it leads me to wanting to say something about what Jasmine, you were saying, in your very wise analysis of the use of language and saying it as it is, calling it as it is, which all the speakers have done, and the discussion has led us to, talking about settler colonialism, talking about speaking out for the Palestinians to have a free Palestine, and not being afraid, which I am sometimes, of being accused of being anti-Semitic or something of that kind, which has also come up in the discussion, simply because I believe in the equal rights for what we hope will become a Palestinian state, in spite of all the obstacles, and Israel. You know, we've heard from speakers about I haven't heard the phrase of the environmental NABCA before, but as an environmentalist who was a Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change and Environment in the Parliament, I think that assessment is absolutely accurate. And in fact, my members' debate in the Parliament was about, I called it thirsting for water, because it wasn't just about having clean water to drink, but clean water for agriculture and clean water, and the ability to go on the water as a fisherman and fish, which was prevented in many ways. So that for me was a symbol of the injustice. And I think also it's been very important to hear about the gender issues, both in relation to the occupation and also the complexities of the shrinking space, whether that's a domestic situation which we want to tackle as feminists in solidarity across the world, or whether it is it is because of the difficulties that women face, particularly in the occupation. So I think it's been a very significant meeting. I hope everyone will agree with me, well beyond this evening and the people who are here. And I hope that, as well as the report, there will be the opportunity for you, Hannah, and others to pull out the dates and information for those who've been part of tonight, so that they can actually, we can all attend the Balfour project webinar, for instance, and learn more about British responsibility, which I happen to know a great deal about because of what my father, as a regular soldier, saw in Palestine and his fight for Palestinian rights in the past. He's no longer alive, but Vincent knew him, I think, as well. But I think it's really important that we have those dates, if we can, Hannah, that would be terrific, as well as the report, which is going to be sent out with the proviso that, very importantly, on this very complex and sensitive issue, that everybody who's taken part and spoken can see what has been said and feel comfortable with it, to the degree that any of us can feel comfortable in the fight ahead. So thank you all very much. And I haven't named speakers by name, but I do, on behalf of everybody who's been here tonight, say with determination, let us remember the asymmetric fight and the rights of Palestinian people and the right of return And wherever Palestinians are, we will be alongside you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for your closing remarks. With regards to the report, just to let everyone know that we will be planning to hopefully publish it by the end of this year. But we will let everyone know if that changes. Other than that, I won't take up any more of your time. I apologize for going 16 minutes over time. And thank you everyone for staying on, especially to our speakers. I thank Senia, Shireen, Irig, Vincent, Jasmine, and of course Claudia for their time and for attending today and for speaking and sharing their expertise today. And I wish everyone a good evening.